Seth? Seth?
Yes, ma'am.
I think we are good to go now. Let's start.
नहीं लगा है। आपका देखिए
Seth?
साउंड बढ़ाइए।
Seth?
Yes, ma'am.
We are good to go. Please start.
Okay. Good afternoon to all my respected seniors and my professional colleagues. I would like to welcome all of you to the most informative, which is on evolution of CSR, corporate social responsibility. Would like to give a brief introduction of this topic, which is CSR is a form of self-regulation to contributing to the well-being of communities and societies through various environmental. I would like our firm, Mamta Binani and Associate, from last 2 years. He is a novice in the field of company law and IBC law. Now it's over to you, ma'am.
Hello, am I audible?
Mridula? Yes, Mridula, you are very much audible.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
Hello, and a very good afternoon to everyone present here. Firstly, I would want to thank all my seniors for giving me this opportunity to deliberate on today's topic, which is evolution of corporate social responsibility. So, before we start, let's have a look on today's agenda for discussion, which is background. We'll give a brief background on the topic, applicability, compliances, eligible activities for CSR, implementing agency and its difference from beneficiary under CSR, ongoing project, and unspent CSR. So friends, as we know, CSR has never been new to India. The concept has very well existed in our Vedas, Upanishads, and epics like Ramayana and Bhagavad Gita. As we know, the concept runs parallel to historical development in India, and before Companies Act 2013, the word corporate social responsibility was not recognized by any law. So we can say that the Companies Act 2013 brought an end to this weight and introduced Section 135. And through this Section 135, the concept of CSR was brought in India, through which it was made mandatory for companies to undertake activities which were beneficial for the society at large. So, as we know, the section has underwent numerous amendments, and one of the major transformation that has happened is the section has transformed from comply or explain to comply or suffer, which is to say, earlier corporates had an option to not spend the amount they were required under the provision and give an explanation for the same in its board report. However, now the same has been made mandatory by inserting penal provisions in the Act. to say, as we know, the penal provisions were decriminalized and increased by the Companies Amendment Act 2020 and came effective from 22nd January 2021. So the penalty slab at present for companies who default in subsection 5 and 6 of the provision is a minimum amount of 1 crore and a maximum of twice the amount required to be transferred to the unspent CSR account or Schedule 7 fund, right? And for officers in default, the minimum amount to be spent would be 2 lakh, and the maximum is 1/10 of the amount required to be spent under the provisions. So moving on to the applicability of the provision. So the companies, every company, including a foreign company having a branch office or project office in India, who attract the following thresholds, which is a net worth of rupees 500 crore or more, turnover of rupees 1000 crore or more, or net profit of 5 crore or more in the preceding financial year, as per the latest audited financial statements, have to comply with the provisions of Section 135 under the Act. So whenever these thresholds are attracted, it's a common like we have seen in a practical life that most of the companies fall under the third threshold, which is a net profit of rupees 500 crore or more. This is the threshold that is attracted most by companies. And once the provisions are attracted, we'll discuss the brief compliances that the companies are required to do under the provision. So the first is formation of a CSR committee. As per the company's CSR policy rules, a CSR committee has to be constituted with at least 3 directors, out of which one has to be an independent director. However, for companies for which the provisions of independent directors under Section 149 of the Act are not attracted, can form CSR committee with 2 or more directors. And exemption has also been given to companies for which expenditure, like the amount to be spent under the provision, is up to 50 lakh rupees. So the compliances that are required to be undertaken by CSR committee in such a case would have to be taken by the board of directors of the company. So CSR committee, once the CSR committee is formed, the first and foremost step that the CSR committee has to undertake is draft a CSR policy. So the CSR policy, as the provision read with the rules, provides that the CSR policy has to provide for the activities which has to be in line with activities specified in Schedule 7 of the Act, right? So the policy has to determine the activities the company intends to undertake under the provision and to discharge its CSR obligation. The committee also has to draft an annual action plan where it has to determine the amount which needs to be spent under CSR, the activities undertaken, the modalities, the implementation schedule, and whether impact assessment is required to be conducted by the company or not. And further, the companies also have to give website disclosures about the composition of the CSR committee. The CSR policy has to be displayed on its website, and the committee has to make sure that the board is informed from time to time, and an annual report on CSR is annexed to the board's report under Section 134 of the Act. When we come down to the monitoring activities, the provision very specifically has provided that the activities or the amount to be spent and the activities undertaken have to be certified by the CFO of the company. So all the amounts that have to be that have to be used or utilized for discharging the CSR obligation have to be certified by the CFO. Post which the company is also required to obtain a utilization certificate after discharging its CSR obligation. When we talk about impact analysis, corporates who have a CSR obligation of 10 crore or more in the preceding 3 financial years are required to undertake impact analysis. So impact analysis basically has to be done for project outlays of 1 crore or more, and only for those projects which have been completed at least 1 year before undertaking the impact analysis, like 1 year before the financial year in which the impact analysis is proposed to be undertaken. Now, impact analysis has to form part of the board report, and the impact analysis, the year in which impact analysis is conducted, the expenditure for that year can be 5% of the CSR expenditure or 50 lakh, whichever is less. So this is a brief compliance requirement that a corporate needs to conduct under the section. Now we'll talk about the eligible activities. So Schedule 7 of the Act has very specifically laid down, which is obviously inclusive, has laid down and has tried to bring about the intent of the legislature as to what activities have to be undertaken by the corporates to fulfill its CSR obligation. So, as to name a few, it's eradication of hunger, promotion of education, gender equality, development of slum, rural areas, contribution to central armed forces, and other activities. However, we can say that the government or the ministry from time to time has linked CSR activities to furtherance of government programs, which is to say that we have seen that during the global pandemic, the government brought about certain circulars and clarifications with respect to expenditure towards COVID-19 vaccines or promotion of COVID-19 vaccines, and promotion about COVID and its hazards. So that was counted or was included in the eligible CSR activities. So companies who expended towards such programs or such activities were very well covered under Section 135 and were very well understood to be have discharged their CSR obligation. So it is very mandatory for companies to understand as to which activities will be eligible under Section 135 and which won't qualify as CSR eligible CSR activities under the Act. Also, corporates have to keep in mind that activities they have to, like there's a provision in the Act which says that they have to focus on the local areas or the areas situated near them. So I think the intent of the legislature has come out very clear, that it wants corporates to kind of uplift the society it is present in and to work towards the society. As we know that birds flock to a tree which bears fruit, right? So it is so we can say that the content or the provision and the intent of law has come out very clear through this schedule, and the provisions have been made clear by determining the activities that have been made eligible under that. Now, one very important amendment which was brought to the provisions was insertion of implementing agency. So the topic, this very word is very ambiguous, as the word has not been clearly defined under law. The law determines as to what entities would qualify as an implementing agency, but the law has not per se defined the term in implementing agency. So, however, by interpreting or reading it harmonious, implementing agency when read differently or separately, implementing as in corporates can maybe in a layman term outsource its CSR obligation or route its CSR obligation through entities prescribed in Rule 4 of CSR policy rules. An agency, as the word describes, we can come down to a conclusion, to a thought that a principal agent relationship ought to exist between a corporate and such implementing agency, right? So as I said, Rule 4 determines, like, so there is this question revolving around implementing agency as to how can a company root or how can it undertake its CSR activities. So I would like to divide it into four parts, which is a company can either directly undertake its CSR obligation and discharge its CSR obligation, and it can also route it through such implementing agency. Now, such implementing agency can be of three types. Firstly, a Section 8 company, registered trust, or registered society, which has been established by the company itself for the purpose of undertaking such CSR activities. Secondly, it can be a public agency, which is to say a Section 8 company, registered trust, or registered society having a track record of at least 3 years, through which a company can engage such an implementing agency to discharge its CSR obligation. Thirdly, government agencies, which is to say entities established by government. So these are the four routes, I would say, through which the company can discharge its CSR obligation. So now there is also an ambiguity that revolves around this term, as to many times corporates cannot distinguish, or there's a confusion as to the funds that we are giving, the entity to which the funds are given, right? We cannot differentiate whether it is an implementing agency or it is a beneficiary. So there is an ambiguity with relation to this, which is our next topic for discussion. Implementing agency vis-a-vis beneficiary. So to differentiate, we can say that an implementing agency, as laid down in the provision, has to be registered with MCA by filing CSR 1, which has to be verified and attested by a practicing company secretary, CA, or cost accountant. And such after filing such form, it has to have a registration number which will be generated after filing such form with the MCA. However, for beneficiaries who are the actual beneficiaries under such activity, they are not required to have such a registration, right? So this is I think this is the primary difference between a beneficiary and an implementing agency. Now, as we said that implementing agency, the word itself gives us a meaning about the term, which is agency. So I believe implementing agency, when we employ or an implementing agency to discharge the CSR obligations of a corporate, there ought to have a principal agent relationship, right? The corporate and the agency will have to establish a principal agent relationship. The agency will be an extended hand of the corporate to conduct its CSR activities. obligation. However, no such relationship a recipient of the benefit. Right now, function as we know that implementing agency carries out or just kind of the CSR obligation is outsourced to such implementing agency, and it overlooks the CSR activities or undertakes the CSR activities on behalf of the corporate. However, as I said, the beneficiary is the recipient of benefit under the provision amount. So now the implementing agency will kind of discharge the CSR obligation, and the expenditure will be made as per the CSR policy of the company. Right, the policy laid down by the company has to be complied with or followed by the implementing agency. However, the beneficiary can expend or has a discretion about expenditure of the amount of CSR as per its own objectives. Like it can expend the amount for furtherance of its own objectives. Now, requirements, obviously, as we said, that implementing agency, the company has to monitor the activities of the implementing agency and obtain a utilization certificate. However, in case of a beneficiary, we don't have to monitor the activities of the beneficiary. We need to have a utilization certificate per se. So I think these are the like basic differences between an implementing agency and a beneficiary. I would want to explain this further with the help of an example. So now if a company routes its funds to an NGO and for a specific cause, right? So the NGO will now route that fund for that cause. NGO here will now act as an implementing agency. But when we directly give the funds to NGO and the NGO has its own schools, hospitals, and it utilizes that fund according to its own discretion, where the NGO is a beneficiary, there it will be entitled or it will be entitled to use the funds as per its own discretion and will be termed as beneficiary. However, when it further routes the funds as per the cause determined by the corporate, it will be designated as a implementing agency. It is to be noted that implementing agencies have to have a registration in CSR 1 firstly, and it has to be registered under section 12A and 80G of the Income Tax Act, which is a mandatory requirement under the provision. So now if we want a trust or a society which is not having such registration, this will be a violation of the provisions of the Act and will not qualify as discharging the CSR obligation. Right? So these are the 3 points that we need to have, we need to keep in mind about implementing agencies. Talk about ongoing project. Ongoing projects have been like defined in the CSR policy. Ongoing project, as the word is a multi-project, right? Have to completely fulfill its CSR obligation in 1 year. It can undertake a ongoing project, but there is a deadline. It cannot go on and on forever, right? So there is a deadline, and the same has to be completed within 3 years of the financial year in which it was commenced, excluding. So like if we commence an ongoing project in this particular financial year, we can or we ought to complete it within 3 years, excluding this financial year. And it also, so it can so happen that companies initially decide that they are going to discharge its CSR obligation towards the project. Now that project subsequently turns into an ongoing project, and so it can accordingly amend and the project and its policy and amend it to a ongoing project. But but the duration has like not beyond 1 year. So the duration has been beyond. So the ongoing project, firstly, the project has to be completed for a year, and then we can extend it for an ongoing project. And the same amendments need to be made in the CSR policy. Now, when we talk about unspent CSR has also been provided in the provisions of law. So we can divide unspent CSR into two parts. First, for an ongoing project, where there is an amount unspent in relation to an ongoing project, and when there is an amount unspent in other cases, like not ongoing projects. So when we talk about ongoing projects, after completion of the first financial year, the amount needs to be transferred to an unspent CSR account within a period of 30 days from the end of such financial year. Further, the amount laying in the unspent CSR account will be used towards the project. However, if after the end of three financial years, as stated in the earlier provision, that the ongoing project has to be completed within 3 years, excluding the financial year in which it was commenced. So after that, if there is any amount laying in that fund, that needs to be transferred to the fund specified under Schedule 7, which is the Swachh Bharat Kosh Fund, or the PM Cares Fund, which has been specified in Schedule 7. Now, and such transfer has to be made within 30 days of completion of such 3 years. Now, in other cases where the project is not an ongoing one, the same has to be done. The same has to be transferred to a Schedule 7 fund and not to an unspent CSR account. It has to be done to a Schedule 7 fund within 6 months of end of financial year. And along with that, the board has to specify the reasons for not spending such amount. So this is a concept, like I would say, these are the two broad heads of unspent CSR account, where there is a demarcation between an ongoing project and an project which is not an ongoing one. I think this is all that I wanted to discuss for today. And are there any questions or?
Mridula, I have a question. Suppose there is a subsidiary company, and on the holding company, the CSR provisions are applicable. So whether the subsidiary company is also required to comply with the CSR provisions?
Thank you for the question, Ankita ma'am. I would want to say that no, the subsidiary need not comply with the provisions of CSR, because the provisions have very well stated that the amount, the threshold limit, as we discussed earlier, the net worth, the net profit, or the turnover has to be seen on a standalone basis. It has, the consolidated figures are not to be considered, right? So when we are talking about the subsidiary, we'll see the standalone statements or financial statements of the subsidiary, and if such thresholds of net worth, turnover, or net profit are attracted, then only the subsidiary will have to comply with the provisions of section 135, or else it will not have to comply with the provisions, only because the holding company has attracted the provisions of law. I hope I'm clear.
Yes. Thank you so much, Mridula. Mridula, there is one question in the chat box. Do you think income tax payers should have option to select utilization area of his tax, like sports, public utilities, social welfare, instead of government, and only those who are not concerned with the utilization should go to PM Care Fund?
Can you please repeat like a bit slowly? I could not follow.
Yes. Do you think income tax payers should have option to select utilization area of his tax, like sports, public utility, social welfare, instead of government, and only those who are not concerned with the utilization should go for PM Care Fund?
I think I would want to kind of say that this is something which is debatable, and the since we are very the provision of the law has kind of provided that the same has to be utilized towards funds that have been specified in Schedule 7, right? So when we talk about discretion here, the user, if they want to exercise this discretion, they have to make sure that such fund forms a part of the schedule, right? So the PM Cares Fund has been specifically provided in the schedule. So when we talk about unspent CSR, that has to be transferred to such fund as per provisions of law. The law does not provide a discretion to the utilization of such unspent CSR amount laid in the account of the corporates with this schedule bank. So I think this is quite a debatable topic, and yes, obviously the stand is not very clear, but going by the letter and spirit of such fund, obviously, which the corporate has objectives or towards its own obligation, I think the very intent provision states that the fund specified in Schedule 7, and hence the discretion has not been provided to the the user as to where it wants to utilize the unspent amount.
Okay, Mridula, since we discussed about the discretion of the board, I would like to ask you that suppose if any project or program is if a company is following a project as per Schedule 7, but that particular project is not prescribed in its CSR policy of the company, then how will the company will go forward with it?
So, as we know, that the intent of a CSR policy is determining the activities it needs to undertake, right? So it might so happen that during the course or during the financial year, it kind of plans to or changes the activities it requires to undertake. So the board can, on basis of justifiable reasons, amend the CSR policy and undertake such activities. However, such amendment has to be in line with Schedule 7 of that.
Mridula.
Thank you.
So
Any more questions?
If audience have any other questions.
Actually, I have one question. Am I audible?
Yes, yes.
Yes, sir.
Hello. Actually, I have one question. If a company wants to donate to a private hospital which is limited by shares, can they do their CSR obligation with the hospital?
So now here, this is like there is there are two approaches to this particular question, right? So the corporate has to decide whether it wants to invest or route its fund to such private hospital. Firstly, the hospital has to comply. Like firstly, so if the corporate wants to route its funds through such hospital, right? So it has to decide whether the hospital is the beneficiary, right? As we discussed, the difference between implementing agency and beneficiary. If the hospital here is the beneficiary, then it surely can do so, since there are no such, requirements or fulfillments of a beneficiary, decides that such hospital will further route the funds towards a particular cause, per se, for building beds in the hospital, or so when the hospital acts as an implementing agency, this is the situation where Rule 4 of the CSR policy rules kicks in. Here we'll have to see that the provisions of these rules, the registration required, whether it is a public trust, a public registered society, and other requirements which are required to be fulfilled by a implementing agency are complied with, and then the corporate can route its fund to the private hospital. However, if the private hospital is a recipient of the benefit, then surely it can route it or discharge its CSR obligation.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome.
And operational expenses of a charitable hospital will be counted as CSR expenditure.
Expenses of a
Hospital.
sorry, sir.
So, charitable hospital.
All right. So I would want to say that operational expenses, so the charitable hospital, right? So the charitable hospital, firstly being a beneficiary, the operational expenses are, so the charitable hospital is a beneficiary, and when a corporate lends its funds to such charitable hospital and it utilizes such funds for the furtherance of its objects, it would very well I think be in compliance with the provisions of the law and very well fulfill the intent of law.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome, sir.
Ma'am, I have a question.
Yes, please.
Company has its own trust. Okay, has a registered trust. Now the trust want to enter into a JV with a temple for its another activity as a part of CSR. Can that trust enter into a joint venture with the temple for this activity?
Yes, so now here this is a very practical question. So now we see this the corporates nowadays have created their own foundations, trusts, to carry out its CSR obligations. So now when such obligations the company has outsourced its activities to such foundation. So when the foundation for undertaking such CSR activities enters into any agreement or employs temples or maybe any entity for discharge of the CSR obligation, it can enter into a joint venture or any sort of employment agreement for furtherance of the objects or for the furtherance of the CSR policy of the company.
Thank you so much, ma'am. One more question: is temple is also necessarily be registered under CSR1?
So now here again we'll have to look at two approaches. When the foundation, as you mentioned, enters into a JV with the temple, right? The temple becomes the a part or an extended hand or an employee of the foundation per se. So here, if we see, there can be an approach that yes, it has to have a CSR1 act, registration. However, if the temple is the recipient of that particular benefit, and we leave it on the temple to kind of discharge the CSR or the fund or utilize the funds as per its own objects, there the temple need not have a CSR1 registration. So as we see, there are a lot of questions arising on this situation, whether one needs to have a registration under CSR1 or not. So here we need to keep in mind whether how we are so the discretion, the main point that we discussed on the discretion, if it is undertaking CSR activities as per the policy of the company, or is acting as an extended hand of the company, or the company is deploying its activities through such agency. This is a situation where the particular agent or the particular entity will have to have a CSR1 registration. However, when the company only gives its funds to such, such entities, such foundations, such trusts, such society, it need not have a CSR1 registration because it is a mere beneficiary of the CSR activities undertaken by the company.
Thank you so much, ma'am. One more query:
Sure.
Can that temple employ a catering contractor to do this activity?
So now here we are talking about a series of contracts, right? So the foundation entering into a contract with the temple further entering into a contract with the. So now we have to see here again. So when we talk about the caterer, right? So the caterer again is implementing the CSR objective of the corporate. So there can be so there can be this approach, and then he is further an employee of the temple. So there can be two routes. If we see that foundation, temple, caterer, two contracts have been entered. However, the foundation has not entered into a contract with the caterer. So there can be approach where if the temple enters into a contract with the caterer need not be enter into a CSR1 because it is the employee of the temple, the trust, the temple, right? And when the foundation will kind of further being a party to that contract employs the caterer, that is where it becomes an agent of the company for discharging the CSR obligation. So there it will need to have a CSR1 registration. So this principal agent relationship is very important to note. I hope I'm clear.
Thank you so much for the clarity. Thank you so
Thank you.
much. Because
Thank you.
there were series of contract being entered this.
Right.
Thank you so much for enlightening us.
Thank you. Thank you.
Is there any other questions that the audience want to ask? I don't think there are any other questions. So I would request Saif to give a vote of thanks to Mridula.
Thank you, ma'am. I would like to express my gratitude to all of you for your presence and contribution to make this webinar a great success. Also, I would like to thank Ms. Mridula Tripathi for enlightening us regarding the topic CSR. This was a very knowledgeable, cultivating session, ma'am. Thank you so much, ma'am.
Thank you, sir.
Yes, thank you, Mridula. It was really a very informative session. We are looking forward for this kind of sessions in future. And thank you everyone for your presence and for your time.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.